And we're good to go. All right. So, last time we had left off here, we had been examining the context-specific nature of our adaptations for learning. And we saw that because learning represents a change in behavior, there are far more ways of behaving in non-adaptive fashions than in adaptive ones. Because there are many more ways of behaving in non-adaptive fashions, we should expect that the learning mechanisms in our brain are tailored to funnel our learning behaviors towards this relatively narrow range of useful ones. Out of all the infinite number of possible things we might learn, there are simply very few of those infinite things that end up being useful in terms of guiding our behavior and representing good investments of our time and our energy. And we also saw that the tasks of learning vary dramatically in terms of what inputs you're going to use to solve them and what behavioral outputs would be generated to also successfully solve the problems that you're learning. So learning about what makes somebody a good mate probably isn't going to inform us very well as to what things in the environment are good to eat. And knowing what things are good to eat doesn't tell us very much about how to behave fearfully, what to behave fearfully towards. And as such, before any adaptations for learning can be useful, these adaptations need to metaphorically know what to learn and how to learn it. The idea that there's this single general purpose learning mechanism in our brain that just solves all problems of life, it's not tenable. It's not something that you can reasonably believe given the evidence. And we saw examples of this that included how to learn what to eat and what to avoid, despite very long time delays in ingesting food and later sickness. We saw that adaptations for learning this food aversion can be very time sensitive in pregnant women that might selectively be lowering their tolerance level for foods during early periods of fetal development to protect the developing fetus. We saw how prepared humans are to learn language, and that young children will manage to create a language of their own out of impoverished inputs if they need to. And we even saw that rats selectively learn the location of food and water using different cognitive rules, being readily able to associate food learning with this idea that food moves around the environment, but they don't tend to apply this same type of learning mechanism to water. Because water doesn't tend to move around the environment. And so a single general purpose learning mechanism would be incapable of knowing that these things are important to learn in the first place without being prepared to selectively attend to these specific variables. Much less would a general purpose learning mechanism be able to learn the specific behaviors required for solving these problems successfully, using this same learning rules. So as such, our adaptations, our multiple adaptations for learning, vary in their form to efficiently solve these important adaptive problems. And one of the problems that we saw last time was avoiding inbreeding. When organisms sexually reproduce, mating with close genetic relatives tends to result in what's called inbreeding depression, where the offspring that result from these pairings of close genetic relatives tend to be less viable than those that result from mating with more distantly related members of your species. And without going too deep into the details as to precisely why inbreeding depression happens, we can note enough for now that organisms need to avoid mating with close genetic relatives, what we would call their family or their kin. And so to avoid these inbreeding outcomes, organisms appear to come prepared with mechanisms to learn who their kin are. Mechanisms for estimating how closely genetically related they are to those around them. And in humans, this appears to strongly focus on proximity during about the first 6 years of life. The people you grew up around when you were young and tend to spend much of your time around, those are more likely to be your kin, to be your family, and we tend to subsequently avoid them as mates, even if they're not actually genetically related to us, as we saw from the Israeli kibbutz studies. However, these outputs of the kin estimation mechanisms in our brain can be used for solving adaptive problems that aren't just related to who you mate with. That is, knowing who your kin are and how closely your kin are related to you, this can guide your behavior in other useful ways beyond just sexual. And as we're going to see today, this information is also vitally important for the evolution of altruism, which refers to our capacity for helping others at a personal cost. Altruism is when I give up something so that you can get something. So providing this help to others at a personal cost, what we could consider altruism or kindness, this represents an evolutionary puzzle that we need to solve. And I say that because if we were to discover an adaptation that existed in one species solely for the benefit of a different species, if we discovered that adaptation, that would falsify the entire theory of evolution. So that is an adaptation that exists to improve the reproductive outcome of a different species at the cost to the bearer would prove completely fatal to evolutionary theory. And the same logic of this puzzle extends into members of your same species as well. So if we found an adaptation that existed in one person solely for the benefit of another person, we need to explain this or else the theory of evolution doesn't work. And indeed, there are adaptations for altruism. As we can see here, mammary glands represent one of the physiological examples of an altruistic mechanism, an altruistic adaptation. In mammals, females have breasts, mammary glands, with the adaptive function of provisioning offspring with milk. The milk is costly for the mothers to produce on a metabolic level, and the benefits of this milk are delivered entirely to another individual, in this case her children. And this represents a biological mystery of the first order, and it requires a special type of explanation. We need to understand how these adaptations for altruism are beneficial to the bearer, that is the mother, or else the presence of mammary glands would disprove evolutionary theory. And I do want to make it clear, before we move on here, that different species do benefit each other all the time, and members of the same species benefit each other all the time. But most of those benefits tend to be incidental instead of intentional. So, for example, there are lots of plants in the world. These plants take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and they produce energy for themselves in this process of photosynthesis. And during the process of this, there's a byproduct they create, which is oxygen. And oxygen, as far as the plant is concerned, is basically a waste product. And so the plants excrete this oxygen. Other animals, like humans, we breathe in this oxygen, and as a byproduct of our respiration process, we excrete carbon dioxide that the plants then breathe back. To the extent you would say plants are breathing anyway. So both, in this case, plants and animals are producing compounds that help one another, but neither species is doing this for the benefit of another. We breathe because we need to do so to survive. And when we exhale, any benefits delivered to other species, this is purely incidental. Nothing about our breathing or the photosynthesis process of a plant is explained well by positing it's this adapted benefit delivery system to other individuals. Plants didn't evolve to produce oxygen because it's good for humans. And humans didn't evolve to produce carbon dioxide because it's good for plants. Similarly, other animals produce dung, and other species, usually insects, might use this dung as a food source. So there's a benefit being produced for these other species, but the animal that's producing the dung doesn't have adaptations because it benefits the insects that eat this. The animals just excrete their waste products and other animals incidentally make use of them. So what we're talking about here is intentional adaptations for altruism, ones that have evolved to deliver benefits to others. And the solution to this mystery of altruism and mammary glands, and also in women, umbilical cords, understanding this mystery begins by understanding the nature of reproduction on a deeper level. Evolution is very focused on reproduction, but what gets reproduced in an evolutionary process isn't an organism per se. That is, when you have a child, what you are reproducing is not yourself. But what you're reproducing, what you're copying, is actually the genetic blueprint for making another organism like you. What's getting produced here, in the very literal sense, is information. Evolution is about reproducing information. In this case, genetic information that we're passing on to our offspring. And this can help us refine our sense of what it means to reproduce in the evolutionary sense of the word. Basically, we are biological machines developed by interactions of genetic and environmental factors whose purpose is to produce more copies of those genes, trying to get more copies of that information into future generations. And the way you can think about this is that our body, all bodies, are basically a gene's way of making more genes. And importantly, these same genes are carried by organisms and offspring. The same genetic patterns of information present in your body are also present in the body of other bodies in the world, specifically your kin, your family. So this includes not just your own offspring, but your parents. It includes your brothers, it includes your sisters, first cousins, second cousins, uncles, nieces, nephews, extended family. These people carry copies of the same genes that are found in your body. And the closeness of this genetic relationship between you is represented by how many genes you share in common with other members of your species. So let's say you're an asexually reproducing species, and you reproduce, as you see here, basically by splitting in half and putting 100% of the copies of your genes into your offspring. So you have a mother cell that divides and splits into two daughter cells. Minus whatever mutations might occur, these are two genetically identical organisms. One's just creating a direct copy of itself. So from the perspective of the genes, of the genetic information that's present in this copy, your daughter cell, your sister cell, however you want to think about relationship here, they also share 100% of your genes. And so, because these two organisms share 100% of their genetic material in common, their reproductive interests begin to align. That is, if you share 100% of your genes with your sibling, if your sibling reproduces, that's just as good as if you reproduced, from the perspective of getting your genes into the next generation. Similarly, the death of an offspring is equivalent to your own death, genetically speaking, because you share 100% of the material in common. This is what evolution is really focused on. So, from this perspective, the reproduction and survival of your kin is just as valuable as your own. And this is because of an entirely overlapping set of genetic interests. So in these circumstances, where you're 100% genetically related to your offspring, adaptations for delivering benefits to them can easily be selected for by an evolutionary process. Because in this case, altruism, where you would give up your own benefit for the benefit of those related to you, this is just as good as benefiting yourself from a genetic point of view. This makes it very easy for adaptations for altruism to evolve. So, from an evolutionary perspective here, we need to take the perspective of replication of genetic material. Take the perspective of the genes instead of the individual, because the genes are the things that are getting reproduced. The individual itself is not getting reproduced. And this same logic is going to hold for sexually reproducing species as well. The main difference is that the degree of genetic relationship is lower. So in humans, for instance, when we reproduce, 50% of our genetic material is recombined with 50% of the genetic material of our partner. And this creates a situation where our reproductive success is tied to the reproductive success of our offspring. It's not just about how many babies we can make, it's about how well our offspring do as well, because they carry copies of our genes. So because our reproductive success, our genetic reproductive success, is now tied up in the success of other bodies, it can become adaptive to help those other bodies survive, succeed, and reproduce. And this is where we start to see a lot of adaptations emerge for mechanisms that are going to provide benefits to others. Whether these adaptations are physiological, like mammary glands, or psychological in nature, such as generating feelings of love, caring, empathy, kindness. This is a great jumping off point for this altruism to evolve. And importantly here, the closer our genetic relationship to another body, the more genes we share in common with that other body, the more likely it's going to be that we care for them as we do ourselves. Because they are, in a very real sense, to a greater degree, actually ourselves, in the sense that evolution can attend to it. Same genes, just found in different bodies. And these shared genetic relationships create the bedrock for mechanisms to evolve which seem to, at least in the proximate sense, be altruistic. Remember, proximate means immediate sense, they're altruistic, whereas in the ultimate sense, we're talking about biological function. So in this case, mammary glands are proximately altruistic. They have an immediate metabolic cost for the mother. They take time and resources to grow and develop the tissue, and then they take metabolic resources to produce the milk, and time to deliver this milk into another body, into an infant. The mother is shouldering all of these metabolic costs and receiving none of the proximate benefits. However, on this ultimate level of analysis, these mechanisms aren't actually altruistic at all. They don't exist to benefit another individual per se, but rather they exist to benefit copies of themselves found in other bodies. Now, that's not to say when a mother is breastfeeding a child, she's being selfish. She's absolutely not being selfish in the proximate sense of the word. But what we're trying to say here is that the altruism mechanism itself, the explanation for its existence, is explained by finding the adaptive benefit in the ultimate sense of the word. In this case, the genes in the body of the mother creating things that benefit those same genes that are found in other bodies, in this case her offspring. Now there are two terms I want to introduce at this point, technically three, but two. We'll go with two, which are the terms kin selection and inclusive fitness. So the first of these, kin selection, refers to adaptations that arise from an evolutionary process because of the benefits they deliver to an organism's relatives. That is, adaptations which are selected for because they benefit your kin, hence the term kin selection, because these kin are carrying some copies of the same genetic material that your own body does. And we've seen the physiological examples of this. We've seen mammary glands. We briefly mentioned umbilical cords. These are altruism adaptations. And in mammals, at least, mothers will produce milk with the purpose of feeding and provisioning their offspring. However, as we've mentioned before, the presence of physiological adaptations, that is, the presence of breasts, physical tissue, also implies the presence of psychological adaptations as well. Psychological adaptations resulting from kin selection. After all, the mammary glands would have been no use to the mother or the offspring if the mother doesn't behave in ways that actually gets the milk to the offspring. That is, she has to allow them to nurse. And this can be time-consuming and painful for the mother, and that requires certain psychological adaptations to generate the behaviors to cause her to lay there and allow her infants to nurse from her. And so accordingly here, we can really begin to understand some psychological adaptations from kin selection, like this deep love and attachment that parents can feel towards their offspring. If you've ever heard, as I have, parents talking about how their entire life changed when they had a kid, and they started behaving differently, and they started thinking differently about the world. What you're witnessing here is the activation of some psychological mechanisms for parental altruism and care for the offspring that are now clicking on inside the minds of the parents because they received the proper stimulus. We all have these adaptations in our head. They're just not active all the time. They require the right environmental input to become active, and in this case, that's the presence of children. Now, I'm sure many of you out there have had or know people that have had bad relationships with their parents. In fact, as we're going to see in some later lectures, there are conflicts that often develop even in these genetically related kin relationships. And these conflicts usually result because each organism is 100% genetically related to itself, but less genetically related to others. And when genetic relationship doesn't overlap 100%, this can sometimes even cause mothers and offspring to have divergent best interests, or siblings to have different best interests. And for the record here, I'm not mentioning this idea that you're 100% genetically related to yourself as some footnote or some throwaway point. The estimates that I've been able to find online, I didn't count obviously, suggest that the human body contains about 30 trillion human cells. That is, about 30 trillion individual organisms collectively make up your body. And these are 100% related to each other. And these 30 trillion organisms are specializing into being different type of tissues, cooperating with each other, and delivering benefits to each other for the benefit of the very small number of them that will get copies of their genes directly into the next generation. And importantly, these 30 trillion individual organisms that make up your body constrain their own reproduction for the benefit of your body as a whole, for the benefit of their 100% genetically related siblings. And indeed, there's a term for what happens when this process goes wrong. When cells in your body stop constraining their own reproduction, we call that cancer. And it's often quite dangerous and quite fatal when not treated properly. So if you want to see examples of mechanisms for altruism in action resulting from kin selection, look no further than your own body and the bodies of all multicellular life. In order for our body to work, we need an incredible amount of altruism, which is allowed to exist because all the cells are 100% related to each other. So in thinking more about these genetic related relationships in humans and species that reproduce like us, we have what we would call a coefficient of genetic relatedness, which is what percentage of your genes you share in common with others. And this is cut in half by every degree you're removed from that person. So we share half our genes in common with both of our parents, and we share half of our genes in common with any full siblings, brothers or sisters. And if one of our parents was to have a child with a different mother or father, this would create a half sibling, so-called because we are half as much related to them as we are a full sibling, in this case 25%. Similarly, grandparents, parents of parents, uncles, brothers of parents, aunts, sisters of parents, these share 25% of their genes in common. Grandparents to grandchildren, aunt to niece, I believe. In the case of first cousins, this goes down to 12.5%, and then half for each further degree removed. So every time someone reproduces, the number of genes you share in common is cut in half. And knowing what we do about evolution and genetic relatedness now, we can begin to understand what would otherwise be a series of puzzling facts and make some predictions about behavior in a large number of species. We can see that all else being equal, organisms, human or otherwise, should be more likely to help and feel closer to their parents, their children, their brothers, their sisters, relative to more distant relations or complete strangers. The closer they're genetically related, the tighter this link, the closer this psychological closeness ought to become, and the more common altruistic or helpful behaviors should also become. More relatedness, more altruism. And this intuition about how genetic relatedness relates to altruism can be mathematically formulated in what you see here. It's called Hamilton's rule, which states that R times B greater than C. Now, in English, rather than math, this is what the equation reads as. Adaptations for altruism can evolve when the cost to an organism, C, is lower than the benefits to another discounted by this degree of relatedness. So in this case, all costs and benefits are measured in reproductive output. So if we put this back into the example of mammary glands, if the reproductive costs to the mother are at least lower than half the benefits to her offspring, selection can favor an adaptation for altruism. So because the milk provided to the offspring carries a massive benefit, at least in the case of humans, which is allowing that offspring to survive, and the cost to the mother is relatively minor, just whatever metabolic costs it takes to create this milk, the mechanism for this altruism can evolve. Because the benefit delivered to the infant is at least twice as large as the cost that the mother shoulders. Now, I fully understand that this is a very impractical measure to discuss. Because after all, how are we realistically measuring what the reproductive costs are to the mother to develop mammary glands and breastfeed her offspring relative to what the benefits to the offspring are? Frankly, we can't do it. The good news here is that we don't have to. Because what this mathematical formulation is here, this is merely the rule that we should expect natural selection to follow. Hamilton's rule determines what we would consider the constraints, or the conditions that must exist when it comes to adaptations for altruism to be selected for. You can think about it as an evolvability constraint. If these metrics aren't met, then the adaptations don't evolve. They don't get selected for. This is just when they can exist. It's not to say that all of our behavior is proximately going to follow this rule, where, like, oh, I would give up my own life if I was saving 3 of my brothers, but I wouldn't do it if I was only saving 1 brother. Hamilton's rule, it's not a psychological theory, it's just a mathematical one for understanding when altruism can evolve. And the next term I want to introduce real quickly is called inclusive fitness. So we saw kin selection, we saw Hamilton's rule. Fitness, in the context of evolutionary jargon, refers to reproductive success. So the better you are at putting copies of your genes into future generations, the more you reproduce, the higher your fitness. This isn't physical fitness, it's a reproductive fitness. So you have your personal fitness, that refers to how many offspring you personally leave behind, how many direct offspring you produce, how many copies of your genes you're putting in the next generation. Whereas your inclusive fitness refers to the number of offspring you produce, as well as the number of offspring that you support. That is, how many total copies of your genes are you helping to get into future generations, irrespective of which bodies they're in? Is it because they came from your body, your sister's body, your cousin's body, your uncle's body? It doesn't matter. Your inclusive fitness are all these copies of the genes. So to put this in an extreme example, if you focus your efforts solely on yourself and you produce 2 offspring, you could end up with what we would consider a lower inclusive fitness than someone who puts their effort entirely into their family, never reproduces themselves, but ensures their brothers and sisters rear 10 additional offspring, say. It's an extreme example, and it's an unrealistic one. But this should help you wrap your mind around what inclusive fitness is. So, now that we have these 3 ideas in our mind, we got inclusive fitness, we got kin selection, we got Hamilton's rule, which amounts to how many genes in your body are found in other bodies, how selection can favor altruism when bodies contain common genes, and the constraints under which altruism can evolve. We can now begin to explore the implications of these and look for deeper understandings of altruism. So if you want to find adaptations for altruism, we should be looking for contexts in which the costs of delivering altruism are low, genetic relatedness between individuals is high, and/or the benefits being received are high. more benefits, more relatedness, lower cost. Now, obviously, before any adaptations, at least in the realm of kin selection, can evolve, you need to set contexts where it's possible for them to evolve. That is, some species solve this adaptive problem of caring for their kin by avoiding it. Their solution is to not care for kin. So, for instance, a sea turtle, mother sea turtle, she may lay her eggs in a hole, she buries them in the sand, and then she leaves. And that's the extent of her investment. The turtle offspring hatch, they have to make their way to the ocean and survive on their own. That's a way a lot of species solve this problem. So there need to be conditions present where kin can benefit each other for any altruistic adaptations to evolve in the first place. Similarly, if you're living in conditions where you might be around your kin, there must be adaptations for estimating who your kin are and how closely they are related to you. Recognition of kin is a key adaptive problem that must be solved, as we saw last time in the case of incest avoidance. But in this case, the same problem exists for altruism. That is, you need to know who your kin are to deliver benefits to them. You can't just be delivering benefits randomly. And in that respect, we can begin to understand a key evolutionary mystery that I alluded to earlier, which is, why is it in mammals that the females lactate and breastfeed their offspring, but males don't? It's not because males don't have nipples. We do. We just don't use those things for the same adaptive purpose. So, the reason that males might have nipples, some might say, is that they're a byproduct of fetal development, whereby all fetuses begin as a default female in mammals. And that's true enough. But that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter, because after all, both males and females have skin and hair and teeth and livers and kidneys and hearts and so on. And these systems and organs all serve similar functions for both sexes. And to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing making it physically impossible for males and females to both develop breasts capable of lactation and provisioning offspring. In fact, that could actually be a rather useful adaptation if you think about it, in the event one parent is incapable of providing milk. Perhaps because the parent abandons the offspring or they die. Having two parents able to provide this could probably give offspring a much better chance at survival. Two providers seems better than one. So why does development only yield one set of functional breasts? And a deeper explanation for thinking about this can be found in this idea of kin recognition. Whatever environmental cues we use to determine kinship, in mammals, mothers have one cue that simply can't be beat. And that's that impregnation occurs internally. That is, a mother can be guaranteed of her genetic relationship to her offspring that she gives birth to under pretty much every natural circumstance. This means when it comes to mothers, their ability to recognize and invest in their kin successfully is all but absolute. They know they're investing in their own children. Fathers don't tend to be so lucky. Males in general don't tend to be so lucky in that regard. While males may have some idea of which children are related to them, that is, if I haven't had sex with a woman and she has a child, there's a 0% chance that I am the father. And if this mother has a child and I have had sex with her, during some particular window, there's a greater than 0% chance I'm the father. But we don't have the absolute certainty mothers do. And returning to Hamilton's rule that we saw before, this makes investment in offspring a far costlier prospect for males, because they might be investing in offspring that are genetically related to them, and they might be investing in offspring that are effectively genetic strangers. And which context is which, the difference here carries rather massive differences for your fitness. And so you can sum this up perhaps with the phrase, "Their mama's babies but they're daddy's maybes. And this lack of paternity certainty, coupled with maternal certainty, can yield radically different solutions to investments in children. For many species, the solution that they stumbled upon is that males invest far less, if anything at all, in offspring relative to females. That is, in many instances, the male investment in the reproductive process can begin and end with insemination, after which the mother basically cares for the offspring on her own. And these vastly different levels of parental investment by sex is also going to carry a great many physiological and psychological implications, which we're also going to return to in future lectures. But for now, it's enough to note that this degree of certainty regarding kin recognition seems to be a very strong driver of adaptations for altruism, and this is likely the reason females lactate and males don't. Males are capable of making costly adaptive mistakes in this domain that females simply are not. And there are other ways of examining this type of kin recognition issue as well. For instance, at least in humans, though I suspect this is true of many other species, if I was to ask you which of your two parents you are closer to emotionally, your mother or your father, mothers tend to win out. And sure, that's probably because in most instances your mother was nicer to you than your father on average. Or mothers are more likely to be the ones raising the children, while fathers are more likely to be distant or ignore them. But why is that the case? Again, this returns back to why do females lactate and why do males not? And I think it goes back to this genetic certainty, at least on some level. There's probably more to the explanation than that, but at least on some level, it's this degree of genetic certainty. So remember this distinction between this proximate and ultimate explanation here. It's easier to be proximately present and kind in the moment and invest in those that are related to you on this ultimate level. And if you can't be assured of that genetic relationship, the cognitive mechanisms for altruism may become more reluctant to provide that assistance. So that could be that children feel closer to their mothers because ultimately mothers have genetic certainty and are more willing to invest in the children because of that. However, I'd go even further. That is, I suspect the relationship difference between how close children tend to be with their mothers and their fathers is in no small part the result of this being a bi-directional relationship. Because mothers can be assured of who their children are, children are also far more assured of who their mother is than who their father is. So, while your father may not actually be your father, your mother is very likely actually your mother. And this can in turn change the willingness of the child to want to form a relationship with that parent, behave altruistically towards them. And children could in some sense become more reluctant to deliver benefits to their fathers than their mothers, because they can't be assured 100% of who their fathers are. Now, none of what I'm saying here, I'm not trying to get down on fathers, by no means. I'm not trying to villainize anyone here. In fact, human males invest what I would think to be, on average, perhaps described almost as a heroic amount in children, at least compared to the males of many other species. Human fathers are incredibly good parents compared to most other species. I'm not trying to say males are bad parents and females are good parents. I'm just trying to note that males and females here have consistently faced different challenges over our adaptive history as a species in this domain of kin investment. And those different adaptive challenges have likely forged different cognitive and physiological mechanisms for altruism. So, let's keep thinking more about these kin relationships, costs, benefits, and relationship coefficients to understand more about altruistic adaptations. As I mentioned above, when all else is equal, parents are equally related to their children as the children are related to the parents. So we might expect parent-child, child-parent relationships to be altruistic in both directions. And indeed they are. So it's not uncommon for children to help their parents, and it's certainly not uncommon for the parents to help their children. And the level of altruism that parents are displaying for their children, humans, it's as plain as can be, whether it comes in the form of provisioning them or protecting them. And has been told to me several times, one reason that parents want to have kids in the first place is that they want family when they're older. They want people to help take care of them when they're older, whether physically take care of them or emotionally take care of them. These relationships are very altruistic in both directions, all else being equal. However, all else usually isn't equal. So, despite an equal genetic relationship between parents and offspring, when it actually comes to the relationships between parents and children, we should expect that most of this altruism is going to flow from parents to the children. Now, part of the reason is obvious. Children, especially young children, are simply less capable of providing benefits to the parents than parents are to provide to the kids. Your young baby is not going to be able to walk, much less help take care of things around the house. But as both parents and children do age to the point that children can provide assistance, there's still plenty of good reasons to suspect most altruism goes from parents to children, and that's because of the age factor itself. Now, age is a very important component of this cost-benefit ratio when it comes to reproductive fitness. Because when a parent is 60 and a child is 20, assistance delivered to the parent simply carries less benefit because the parent is going to die sooner. By the age of 60, much of the parent's direct reproductive fitness has already been realized. They're probably not having too many more kids post-60. By contrast, that 20-year-old, assuming they live to be as old as their parents, still has at least 40 additional years of reproductive viability to go. And this should really be expected to skew altruism in particular directions to where it's likely to have its largest benefits in the future. So there's simply more benefit to be obtained from investing in a family member who has 50 years of life ahead of them than there is to invest in a family member that has 10. In much the same way, some of you have owned cars before, and you might have realized after owning a car for a while, it's breaking a lot, and you have to keep going in and getting your car fixed. And at some point, the costs of fixing that old car begin to outweigh the costs of just buying a new car. This is the exact same logic that plays out in our own lives when it comes to altruism. And this idea here can really help us understand why many aging parents develop feelings of not wanting to be a burden on their families. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before. I'm sure a lot of you can imagine not wanting to be a burden to your family when you're older. Granted, very few people want to be burdens to others in general. It doesn't do wonders for our social desirability if we're burdens. But I suspect many parents would be particularly concerned about this as they age because of our psychological adaptations for kin-directed altruism. We don't want our family to be investing in us when we're not likely going to be able to provide much benefit genetically, so to speak, in the future, when they could better be spending that investment on themselves. And we can see these thoughts play out quite literally in the play Death of a Salesman, if you've ever read that before. General premise of which is there's this aging salesman father, and he's beginning to detect his ability to provide for his family waning. And what he ends up doing at the end of the play is committing suicide in the hopes that the money from his life insurance policy is going to be channeled towards his children so that they can go on and do great things in life. A great example of psychological adaptations being put into play form and what makes those plays so compelling and understandable. So to examine these predictions in an empirical examples, let's look at a few studies of helping in humans. This is by no means going to be a comprehensive list of studies on altruism, but they're going to paint a picture. And this picture is one we're going to expect to see. In the first of these studies, there were 300 women, and they were asked about times they had provided or received help in their life. And this generated about 2,500 examples of giving and receiving help, like helping someone move, giving someone money to join a membership somewhere, any type of helping like that, whatever they could recall. And they were asked who they were helping and what help they were providing. And the pattern of results that we saw here follows the predictions from inclusive fitness perspectives very well. So about 30% of the help people reported occurred among family members, genetic relatives. But it was skewed very heavily towards closely related members of the family. Specifically, about 70% of the help that was listed for family members occurred when genetic relatedness between the helper and the helpee was 50%. That is, about 70% of the help directed within families that people mentioned was provided either between parents and offspring or brothers and sisters. So 70% of the family help was in those close relationships. By the time you hit 25% relatedness, a half-sibling, an uncle, the amount of altruism fell off dramatically. It went from about 70% to below 25%. And when it came to help provided to more distant family members than 25%, it was almost non-existent. It was there, but it was very low. And importantly, there was a distinct age effect here as well. Older women reported being far more likely to help younger family members than vice versa. Now, what's also clearly important and worth noting about the study is that only 30% of the help people discussed occurred between family members. A lot of the help occurred between non-family members. Strangers, genetically, so to speak. And there are 2 points to make about this before we move on to the next study. The first of these is that women were asked to just recall times they helped or were helped. And I don't know that when you're asking someone about this, the first thing that's going to come to someone's mind would be like, oh, I bought food for my child. They're not necessarily going to think about that as help in the same way as my sister helped me move. So there could be a little bit of a bias in what people report and think about as help. And the second important part here is that in humans, we're also usually massively helpful towards non-genetic relatives, towards friends, and sometimes even strangers. Our cognitive mechanisms for altruism do not solely exist within the domain of genetically related family members, and we're going to see more examples of that in the next lecture. Now, the study we just talked about is what you would call naturalistic in nature. That is, they just reported on observations of things that naturally occurred during life. And they weren't trying to implement any external controls. So while that study is definitely useful, it can mean the results are somewhat messy and more difficult to interpret. So as such, there are ways you can do more tightly constrained, tightly controlled studies that are a bit more artificial, but help you examine people's psychological responses experimentally. So one of these would be a simple forced choice response to a hypothetical scenario. In this case, let's say I told you there's a house containing 3 of your family members and it's on fire. All 3 family members are trapped inside. Without your help, all 3 are going to die, and you have time to only save one of them. Knowing that, which of the 3 family members are you going to choose to help? Which are you most likely to help? Which are you least likely to help? And this was the setup used by research study by Bernstein and his colleagues, where they asked 86 Japanese and 72 American college students about a number of these forced choice scenarios, where the family members varied by sex, they varied by degree of genetic relatedness, and they varied by age. And they're just asking these people, of these 3 family members, who are you most likely to help, who are you least likely to help? And it really didn't matter whether you asked men or women, or whether you were asking Japanese or American students, same general pattern of results fell out. which is that when you're thinking about these life and death scenarios, the higher the degree of genetic relatedness, the more likely they were to help that recipient. And this difference was more pronounced than it was for lower stakes everyday type of help, like driving someone to a bus. The more life and death the scenarios became, the greater this genetic relatedness factor became important. Similarly, in the life or death scenarios, the age of the recipient was very important. Younger family members tended to receive more help than older family members. And as we mentioned before, this makes sense in light of the fact that older individuals simply have less of a reproductive future ahead of them. As their value to your inclusive fitness tends to be lower than a child that has yet to realize its reproductive potential, help naturally tends to flow towards younger individuals in these cases. So it's not just that younger people need more help, because in everyday scenarios of help, like driving someone to the bus, participants were actually more likely to provide help to elderly individuals than, say, middle-aged ones. Whereas when it came to life or death situations, it was always towards the younger generation. And female family members also tended to receive more assistance than did male family members, which perhaps suggests something important about the relative degree of genetic assuredness that you can have in the offspring of female relatives compared to men. The effect wasn't massive, but it's worth making a note of. And one last point I want to mention about this study, which is that the authors introduce it in a very fun way, where they talk about the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission. And what this commission does is it bestows awards on individuals who display unusual bravery in the course of helping someone else. And this commission lists, officially as a requirement, that the person who helps another, in order to receive this award, must have no full measure of responsibility for the safety of the victim. In other words, here, what this means is that the Hero Fund Commission typically excludes from consideration, however brave, acts of family members helping each other, especially close relationships like parents and children. They recognize intuitively, they're probably not using evolutionary theory to think about this, but they intuitively recognize that our inclinations for helping family differ in kind from our adaptations for helping non-relatives. But without an understanding of kin selection and inclusive fitness, this exclusion criteria would make little sense. It would be like saying, we're going to exclude women who help women, or we're going to exclude people who help someone from the same country. It makes much more sense to exclude family members because you understand on some intuitive level this overlap of genetic best interests, where it's like helping yourself. Simply put, heroic deeds look less heroic when there's this element of self-interest perceived to be there. And that certainly seems to be the case in family-oriented help. So now look at what happens in hypothetical life or death scenarios. Let's shift gears here ever so slightly and look at what happens in scenarios that just involve the death part. No life or death, just death. And take a peek at what happens in inheritance. Now, this isn't genetic inheritance, but rather the inheritance of physical resources, where after people die in many societies, they leave behind some record of who they want their possessions to be distributed between. Who gets the house? Who gets the car? Who gets my money? Who gets my stuff? So in an examination of who people tend to leave their wealth to after death, we can probably learn a lot about our mechanisms for altruism. And in one research paper, they looked at 1,000 such instances in Canada. 1,000 patterns of inheritance. And what they found is over 90% of the estate, the total wealth of that person, was left to either kin or spouses, with less than 10% left to non-relatives. So while spouses, at first you might think that a spouse isn't a relative, they do represent a rather interesting kind of non-relative. Specifically, a husband or a wife is typically the person you're going to have a child with and raise that child with. And in that sense, leaving money to a spouse is kind of like investing in family because that spouse is going to continue to invest in the children. But if we exclude spouses, if we look at just the amount left to genetic family members, those relatives sharing half of their genes with the deceased, brothers, sisters, parents, and children, they received 50% about of the total estate, 46% technically. So 50% relatedness, that was about half of the total estate left in the wills. Relatives sharing 25%, they got 8%. So one generation removed went from 46% of the estate to 8%. You cut it one more generation, now less than 1% of wealth is left to people that shared 12.5 or less percent of genes in common. Overwhelmingly, people left their money to close genetic relatives. And the distribution of wealth also followed our predicted pattern of age. People tended to leave more money to their children than to their siblings, because children have more years of reproductive future ahead of them, even if you're just as genetically related to your siblings as you are your children. In fact, children received about 4 times as much money as the siblings, despite this identical genetic overlap. So as we see here, when people die, they do tend to overwhelmingly leave their fortunes to family members and those that they have reared children with. And the more closely they're related, the more they get, and the younger they are, the more they get. All supported predictions of kin selection and inclusive fitness theories. Another very interesting aspect of kin-directed altruism is to examine paternity certainty, thing we talked about before. So as we mentioned previously, mothers can be guaranteed assured who their children are in a way fathers can't. Now this relationship holds for mothers' family members as well. Children can be more assured of who their mother is than who their father is. And more distant relatives can be assured of sharing genes with the offspring of their sisters and their daughters relative to that of their brothers or their sons. So as such, we might expect that family members tend to preferentially invest their altruistic behaviors in the offspring of women relative to men in an all else being equal type of world. And so I looked at this in the case of investment of grandparents, because this can represent a particularly striking case, as you have an additional level of genetic relatedness removed. So think about this here. If you're a woman and you have a daughter, you can be confident that any grandchildren your daughter produces are related to you. You know who your daughter is, and you know who your daughter's children are 100%. However, if you're a man and you have a son, you now have both reduced certainty that the son is related to you, and you have less certainty that your son's offspring are related to you. So in one case, you have 2 guaranteed links. In the other case, you have 2 possible breakages in the links. So you might think then that this yields a prediction worth exploring, which is that when it comes to grandparents, mothers' mothers should invest more in a grandchildren than a father's father. By contrast, fathers of daughters and mothers of sons both experience one possible break in the genetic lineage and should invest an intermediate amount. And indeed, this is exactly the pattern of results we saw. In one of these studies, they asked 120 U.S. undergrads to report on the emotional closeness they had with their grandparents, how much time they spent together, how many gifts they received from their grandparents. And as predicted, grandchildren felt closest to, spent more time with, and received more resources from their mother's mother than their father's father. Fathers' fathers tended to invest the least. And this pattern has been found a couple times over. They replicated it in a sample of 600 Germans as well. Similar pattern you see across cultures. And so while the examples we saw today are by no means comprehensive when it comes to understanding altruism and kin selection, they're pretty good foundations to start thinking about these issues from. If you're looking for adaptations for altruism, you want to find cases where the costs of providing help are reduced, the benefits of receiving help are high, and the relatedness between the giver and the receiver are maximized. And this idea of inclusive fitness and kin selection can really help us think about how benefiting copies of common genes in other bodies makes sense and represents a form of, you could call it genetic selfishness, where helping those who share genes with you is quite literally helping yourself in some capacity, or at least the part of yourself that the evolutionary process can metaphorically pay attention to. Now, of course, humans aren't just altruistic towards kin. They're altruistic towards spouses. They're altruistic towards friends. And sometimes we're even altruistic towards strangers. And in the absence of this relatedness factor from Hamilton's rule, we need to start thinking about how altruism, adaptations for it, can arise between non-relatives, what benefits givers might receive in the long term from their proximately altruistic behavior, and how the problems of cooperating with non-kin can differ in very important ways from altruism directed at kin. There should be different problems that have to be solved in these different domains, and this should mean that there are new suites of psychological adaptations that govern, say, the relationships of altruism between friends or strangers that aren't the same ones that govern altruism towards families. That is to say, if a mother is breastfeeding her infant, she's likely engaging a number of different cognitive adaptations than if you have a case where one friend is helping another friend move, or a man is buying a woman dinner on a date. Even though these are all proximately altruistic behaviors, they are likely governed by entirely different sets of psychological adaptations, or at least partially different sets of psychological adaptations for altruism. And so next time, we're going to do is examine altruism in the form of social exchange, that is, acquaintances, friends. Think about the adaptive problems that need to be solved successfully to navigate those relationships, and take a look at some cognitive adaptations we have for managing them as well.